Boccaccio's Decameron, second day, fifth story. The stones found by Landolfo, began Fiammetta, whose turn it was to tell the next story, have put me in mind of a tale almost as full of perils as the one narrated by Loretta. But it differs from hers in that its dangers arose in the space of a single night, as you shall hear, whereas in Loretta's story they were perhaps spread over several years. I was once informed that there lived in Perugia a young man whose name was Andreuccio di Pietro, a horse dealer, who, having heard good reports of the Neapolitan horse trade, stuffed 500 gold florins in his purse and, though he had never left home before, set out for Naples with one or two other merchants. He arrived one Sunday evening as darkness was falling, and the next morning, having been told by his innkeeper how to get there, he went to the market. He saw a great many horses, to a number of which he took a liking, and he made offers on several of them, without however being able to strike a bargain. But in order to indicate his willingness to buy, he kept pulling out his purse, bulging with florins and waving it about in full view of all the passers-by, thus displaying a lack of both caution and experience. While he was conducting his business in this manner and holding out his money for inspections, it happened that a young Sicilian woman passed by, without attracting his attention. She was not only very beautiful, but willing to do any man's bidding for a modest fee. And when she saw the purse, she immediately fell to thinking how contented she would be if she could lay her hands on the money. However, she walked straight on. She was accompanied by an old woman, also Sicilian, who, on seeing Andreuccio, allowed her companion to go on ahead, while she herself rushed over to him and threw her arms around him in a display of affection. On seeing this, the young woman said nothing, but held herself aloof from the proceedings and waited for the other woman to catch her up. Andreuccio, having turned round and recognized the old woman, made a great fuss of her and extracted a promise that she would call and see him in his inn. After conversing briefly with him, she then went away, and Andreuccio returned to business, without, however, purchasing anything that morning. The young woman, having spied Andreuccio's purse and noted how well her companion was acquainted with him, was determined to see if she could find some way of relieving him of the whole or a part of his cash. So she began to put out feelers, asking the older woman who he was, where he came from, and what he was doing in Naples, and how it came about that she knew him. Andreuccio himself could hardly have furnished her with a more particular account of his affairs than the one given her by the old woman, for she had lived with Andreuccio's father over a long period in Sicily, and lay there in Perugia. Moreover, she was also able to reveal where he was staying and why he had come to Naples. Now that she was fully informed about his family and the names of his various relatives, the young woman devised an ingenious plan for achieving her object. On arriving home, she gave the old woman enough work to occupy her for the rest of the day, so that she could not keep her appointment with Andreuccio. Then she took aside a maidservant of hers, to whom she had given thorough grounding in affairs of this sort, and toward evening she sent her to the inn where Andreuccio was staying. On arrival at the door of the inn, she happened to run across our hero, who was by himself, and she asked him where she could find Andreuccio. When he told her that he was the very man, she threw him aside and said, "Sir, there is a gentlewoman at this city who would be glad of a few words with you, if you have no objection." When he heard this, Andreuccio immediately assumed on looking himself up and down and thinking what a handsome fellow he was, that the woman must have fallen in love with him, as though he were the only good-looking youth at that time to be found in Naples. So he readily agreed, and asked where and when the lady would like to see him. "You may come whenever you wish, sir," said the maid. "She is waiting for you at her house." "Lead the way, then," Andreuccio promptly replied. "I'll follow you." And without leaving any message at the inn, off he went. The maid conveyed him to the lady's house, which was situated in a quarter called the Flesh Pot. That's a translation. It's basically the red light district of Naples, the mere name of which shows how honest a district it was. But Andreuccio neither knew nor suspected anything of all this, being of the opinion that he was on his way to see a gentlewoman in a perfectly respectable part of the city. Eventually, with the maid leading the way, they arrived at the lady's house, and Andreuccio went boldly in. The maid had already hailed her mistress with the words, "Andreuccio's here," and as he mounted the stairs, he saw the lady coming out on the landing to receive him. She was still very young, tall in stature, with a very beautiful face, and her clothes and jewelry were a model of good taste. Just before Andreuccio reached her, she opened her arms wide, descended 3 steps to meet him. Then she clasped him around the neck and remained for some time without speaking, as though hindered by a surge of powerful emotion. Finally, her eyes filling with tears, she kissed his brow and said in a somewhat faltering voice, "Oh, Andreuccio, my dear, how delighted I am to see you." Not knowing what to make of this barrage of affection, he replied in tones of deep astonishment, "My lady, the pleasure is mine." Then she took him by the hand and led him up to the main room of her house, from whence, without another word, she passed with him into her bedroom, which was all fragrant with roses, orange blossoms, and other pleasant odors. There he saw an exquisite curtained bed, a large number of dresses hanging from pegs, as is the custom in those parts, and other very beautiful, expensive-looking objects. He had never seen such finery before, and was firmly convinced that the lady must be nothing less than a genuine aristocrat. Having made him sit by her side on a chest at the foot of the bed, she began to address him as follows. "Andreuccio, I am quite sure you must be astonished at me for embracing you like this and bursting into tears, for you do not know me, and it may be that you have never even heard of me before. But you are now to hear something that will possibly increase your astonishment. For the fact is that I am your sister. I have always longed to meet all my brothers, and now that God has been good enough to allow me to see one of them, I shall no longer die disconsolate when the time comes for me to depart this life. But in case you know nothing of this, I will tell you all about it. Pietro, who is my father as well as yours, lived for many years in Palermo, as I suppose you may have heard. Being a good and amiable man, he was greatly loved there, and he is still loved there to this day by those who knew him. But of all his profound admirers, none loved him more than my mother, who was a widowed lady of gentle birth. Indeed, she loved Pietro so deeply that she abandoned all fear of her father, her brother, and her good name, and their friendship became so intimate that it led to the birth of the person you see here now sitting beside you. When I was still a little girl, Pietro's business called him away from Palermo, and he returned to Perugia, leaving my mother and me to fend for ourselves, and as far as I've been able to discover, he never gave either of us another thought. For this reason, but for the fact that he was my father, I would be inclined to reproach him bitterly, considering, to say nothing of the affection he should have had for me, his own daughter, born neither of a serving wench nor of any low-class woman, the ingratitude he displayed towards my mother, for she, prompted by her unwavering devotion, surrendered herself body and soul to this man without so much as knowing who he was. But never mind about that. Wrongs committed in the distant past are far easier to condemn than to rectify. At all events, the fact is that he abandoned me when I was still a tiny child in Palermo, where I eventually grew up, and my mother, being a wealthy woman, married me off to a worthy nobleman from Girgenti, who, out of affection for my mother and myself, came to live in Palermo. Being a staunch supporter of the Guelphs, he began to intrigue on behalf of King Charles of Naples. But before the plot could be sprung, it reached the ears of King Frederick, and we had to flee from Sicily just as I was about to become the greatest lady in the island. Of our huge store of possessions, we took away only those few things we were able to carry with us, and leaving behind our lands and palaces, we came as refugees to this country, where we found King Charles so well disposed towards us that he made good some of the losses we had suffered on his account. He gave us estates and houses, as you will see for yourself. He makes generous and regular provisions for my husband, or in other words, your brother-in-law. And that, my dear, sweet brother, is how I came to be in Naples, where, thanks more to God than to yourself, I have met you at last. And having said all this, sobbing with affection, she embraced him a second time and kissed him once again on the forehead. She had told her tale very glibly and with great self-assurance, neither stammering at any point nor swallowing any of her words. For his part, Andreuccio remembered that his father really had been in Palermo, and he knew from his own experience how lightly young men are apt to regard the love of a woman. So what with her tears of affection, her fond embraces, and her chaste kisses, he was more than satisfied that she was telling the truth. And when she had finished, he replied, "I beg you not to take my amazement too much to heart, madam. For to tell you the truth, I have never had the slightest knowledge of your existence. For some reason or other, my father never spoke of you, and your mother, or if he did, I never came to hear of it. But I am all the more delighted to find my sister in Naples because I was feeling rather lonely here, and this discovery was so unexpected. I myself am merely a small trader, but I know of no man, however exalted his station, who would not be equally delighted upon finding such a sister. There is one thing, though, that I would like you to explain. How did you know I was here?" To which she replied, "I learned about it this morning from a poor old woman who often comes to see me because she spent a long time with our father in Palermo and Perugia, or at least she tells me she did. And if it weren't for the fact that I thought it more decorous for you to come to my own house than for me to visit you in another's, I would have called to see you hours ago." After saying this, she began to inquire about all his relatives, naming each one individually, and Andreuccio, allowing himself to be led even further up the garden path, told her how they all were. As it was very hot that evening, and they had been talking together for some little time, she sent for some Greek wine and sweetmeats, and saw that Andreuccio was given something to drink, after which he got up to go, saying it was time for supper. She refused to allow him to do any such thing. On the contrary, pretending to be deeply hurt, she flung her arms around his neck, saying, "Alas, now am I quite certain how little you care for me? What else am I to think, when you are with a sister you have never seen before in her own house, where you should have stayed from the moment you have arrived, and now you want to leave me to go and have supper in some inn? Really? You are going to sup with me. My husband is not home, for which I am very sorry, but though I am merely a woman, I am quite capable of supplying you with a little hospitality." Andreuccio, not knowing how else to reply, said, "I care for you just as much as any man should care for his sister, but if I don't go back, they will be waiting for me all evening to turn up for supper, and I shall cut a bad figure." Whereupon she said, "Good heavens! As if I didn't have anyone in the house who could be sent to tell them not to expect you. But you would be doing a much greater kindness, and no more than your duty, if you were to send word to your companions that they should come and have supper here. And then afterwards, if you still insist on leaving, you could all go back to the inn together." Andreuccio replied that he would rather do without his companions that evening, and that he would place himself entirely at her disposal, if this was what she really wanted. She accordingly went through the motions of sending word to the inn that they should not expect him for supper. Then, after a lot of further talk, they sat down to a splendid supper consisting of several courses, which he cunningly prolonged until darkness had completely fallen. Then they got up from table, and Andreuccio said he would have to go, but she refused to hear of it under any circumstances, telling him that Naples was no place to wander about at night, especially if one was a stranger, and that when she had sent word to the inn not to expect him for supper, she had told them he would not be sleeping there either. He swallowed all this, and since, being taken in by appearances, he was enjoying her company, he stayed where he was, After supper, she engaged him, not without her reasons, in a protracted conversation about this and that, and when the night was well advanced, she left Andreuccio to sleep in her room with a page boy. Sleep in her room with a page boy to show him where to find anything he needed, while she herself retired to another room with her maidservants. The heat was stifling, and so, on finding himself alone, Andreuccio stripped to his doublet and removed his hose and breeches and laid them under his bolster. Nature demanded that he should relieve his belly, which was inordinately full, so he asked the page where he could do it, and the boy showed him a door in one of the corners of the room, saying, "Go through there." And Andreuccio passed jauntily through and chanced to step onto a plank, which came away at its other end from the beam on which it was resting, so that it flew up into the air and fell into the lower regions, taking Andreuccio with it. Although he had fallen from a goodly height, he mercifully suffered no injury, but he got himself daubed in the head, daubed from head to foot, in filthy mess, with which the place was literally swimming. Now, in order to give you a clearer picture of what had preceded and what follows, I shall describe the sort of place it was. In the narrow alleyway, such as we often see between two houses, some boards and a place to sit had been rigged up on two beams running across from one house to the next, and it was one of these boards that had collapsed under Andreuccio's weight. So, finding himself down there in the alley, Andreuccio, cursing his bad luck, began calling out to the boy. But as soon as he had heard him falling, the boy had hurried off to tell his mistress, who rushed into her room and made a rapid search for Andreuccio's clothes. These she found, together with his money, which, being a doubting sort of fellow, he stupidly carried with him wherever he went. And so it was that this woman of Palermo, this self-styled sister of a Perugian, obtained the prize for which she had laid her trap. Being no longer interested in Andreuccio, she quickly went and locked the door through which he had passed just before he fell. Receiving no answer from the boy, Andreuccio began to call more loudly, but it was of no use. His suspicions being already aroused, he began now that it was too late to see how he had been hoodwinked, and having climbed a low wall dividing the alleyway from the road, he scrambled down into the street and went up to the front door, which he was easily able to identify. He stood there for ages, vainly calling out and shaking and beating the door for all he was worth. Finally, plainly perceiving the predicament he was in, he burst into tears and said to himself, "Oh, poor me, what a sudden way to lose 500 florins and a sister." He said a lot more besides, then began to shout and to pummel on the door all over again, creating such a disturbance that he woke a number of the people living nearby, who got up out of bed as they could not endure the racket. One of the woman's maids came to the window all blurry-eyed and said in tones of annoyance, "Who's knocking down there?" "Oh," said Andreuccio, "don't you recognize me? I am Andreuccio, the brother of Madonna Fiordaliso." "My good man," she replied, if you have had too much to drink, go and sleep it off and come back in the morning. I don't know any Andreuccio. You are talking nonsense. Be off with you, for goodness sakes, and let us sleep." "What?" said Andreuccio. "Talking nonsense, am I? You know very well I am not. But if it's really true that Sicilians make a habit of discovering blood relatives and then forgetting all about them, at least give me back the clothes I left there, and I'll go away gladly." "My good man," she said heartily, able to contain her laughter, "you must be dreaming." As she said this, she simultaneously withdrew her head and closed the window, whereupon Andreuccio, who no longer had the slightest doubt that he had lost everything, grew so distressed that whereas he was very angry to begin with, he now became almost frantic with rage. Deciding that force was a more effective weapon than words for retrieving his belongings, he picked up a large stone and started all over again, to rain blows on the door like a madman, this time with much greater energy. Taking exception to this hammering, many of the neighbors, previously roused from their beds, now appeared at their windows and regarded him as some troublemaker who had invented the things he was saying in order to make this good woman's life a misery. They began to shout in unison, like all the dogs in a particular district howling at a stray. "This is a fine way to carry on," they shouted, coming around here at this hour, knocking out up honest women with your ridiculous tall stories. For heaven's sakes, clear off, man, and please, let us get some sleep. If you have any business with this lady, leave it till the morning, and stop annoying us like this in the middle of the night." Being perhaps encouraged by this chorus of abuse, a man concealed inside the house, who was the good woman's bully, and whom Andreuccio had as yet neither seen nor heard, came to the window and said in a low, fierce, spine-chilling growl, "Who's that down there?" Andreuccio raised his head towards the point from which the growl was coming, and caught sight of a face which, so far as he could judge, clearly belonged to some mighty man or other, who had a thick black beard and was yawning and rubbing his eyes as though he had just been roused from a deep sleep. "It's me," replied Andreuccio, not without marked trepidation, "the brother of the lady who lives here." The man did not wait for Andreuccio to finish, but adopting an even more threatening tone, he exclaimed, "I don't know what restrains me from coming down there and giving you the biggest pasting you've ever had in your life, you miserable drunken idiot, making all this racket in the middle of the night and keeping everybody awake." Then he retired from view and bolted the window. Being better informed than Andreuccio about the sort of person he was, some of the neighbors addressed Andreuccio in a hushed, compassionate tone, saying, "For God's sakes, be a good chap and take yourself off, unless you want to be killed down there tonight. Do go away for your own good." So Andreuccio, terrified out of his wits by the man's voice and appearance, urged on by the advice of these people, whose words seemed to him to be prompted by Christian charity, set off with the intention of returning to the inn. He had no idea where he was, so he simply struck out in the direction from which, following in the maidservant's footsteps, he had come on the previous day. All he felt certain of was that he would never see his money again, and that he was the most wretched man alive. However, he had not progressed very far when he became uncomfortably aware of the odor emanating from his person, and deciding he had better make for the sea in order to have a wash, he turned off and to the left and started to walk along a street known as the Ruga Catalana. Boccaccio lived in Naples for a while, which is why he knows this place so well. As he approached the upper part of the city, he happened to see two people coming toward him carrying a lantern, and fearing lest they might turn out to be officers of the watch or a pair of cutthroats, he decided to avoid them by slipping quietly into a nearby hut. But the two men also came into the same hut, as though it were the place they had been heading for. Once inside, one of them put down some iron tools he had been carrying over his shoulder, and they both began to inspect these and pass various comments about them. Presently, the first man said, "What can be causing this unholy stench? I reckon it's the worst I've ever smelled." As he said this, they raised their lantern a little, and catching sight of poor Andreuccio, they let out a gasp of astonishment and demanded to know who he was. Andreuccio at first said nothing, but when they took the light nearer to him and asked him what he was doing there, covered with filth in this manner, he told them the whole story of his adventures. The two men, who could well imagine where all this had taken place, said to each other, "It must have happened round at Butch Belchfire's place." Then one of them said, addressing Andreuccio, "Listen, friend, you may have lost your money, but you can thank God that you happened to fall and couldn't get back into the house. Because if you hadn't fallen, you can rest assured that as soon as you were asleep, you would have been done in. And in that case, you'd have lost your life as well as your money. What's the use of crying over spilt milk? You've about as much chance of plucking stars from the heavens as you have of recovering a single penny. But you may very well have your throat cut if you ever breathe a word about it and he finds out." The two men then conferred briefly together, after which they said to him, "Look, we're feeling sorry for you. And since we're on our way to do a little job, if you'd like to join us, we can almost guarantee that your share of the proceeds will more than make up for what you've lost." And as he was feeling desperate, Andreuccio agreed to go with them. Now, just a few hours earlier, the burial had taken place of an archbishop whose name was Messer Filippo Mintinolo. a real person, by the way. He was the Archbishop of Naples, and he had been buried with some very valuable regalia, and wearing a ruby on his finger worth more than 500 golden florins, which these two fellows were on their way to plunder. They disclosed their intention to Andreuccio, and being more covetous than well advised, he set off in their company. As they were on their way to the cathedral, with Andreuccio still putting forth a powerful odor, one of them said, "Couldn't we find some place or other where this fellow could wash, so that we didn't stink so appallingly?" "Certainly," said the other. "Not far from here there's a well, which always used to have a pulley and a big bucket at the top. Let's go there and give him a quick wash." On reaching the well, they found that the rope was still there, but the bucket had been removed. So they hit on the idea of tying him to the rope and lowering him into the well so that he could wash himself down below. When he had finished washing, he was to give the rope a tug, and they would haul him up again. Shortly after they had lowered him into the well, some officers of the watch, feeling thirsty on account of the heat, and also because they had been chasing somebody, happened to come to the well for a drink. When the other two saw them coming, they immediately took to their heels, making good their escape without being spotted by the officers. Meanwhile, Andreuccio, having completed his ablutions at the bottom of the well, gave a tug on the rope. The officers had taken off their surcoats and laid them on the ground beside their bucklers and pikestaffs, and they now began to haul away at the rope, thinking it had a bucket full of water attached to it. When Andreuccio saw that he was nearly reached the top of the well, he let go of the rope and threw himself on the rim, climbing it with both hands, or clinging to it with both hands. On seeing this apparition, the officers were filled with sudden panic, and without a word, they dropped the rope and began to run as fast as their legs would carry them. Andreuccio stared at them in blank amazement, as if he hadn't held on, and if he hadn't held on tightly, he would have fallen to the bottom, perhaps being killed or doing himself serious injury. However, he clambered out, and when he saw these weapons, he grew even more perplexed, for he knew they had not been left there by his companions. Bewailing his misfortune and fearing lest anything worse should befall him, he decided to leave all these things where they were and clear off. So away he went without having the slightest idea where he was going. As he was walking along, he came across his two companions, who were on their way to the well to haul him out. They could hardly believe their eyes when they saw him coming, and they asked him who had helped him out. Andreuccio said he didn't know, and gave them a detailed account of how it had happened, describing what he had found lying beside the well. Putting two and two together, they had a good laugh and told him why they had run away, and explaining who it was that had hauled him out of the well. And without wasting any more words, the night already being half spent, they made their way to the cathedral, which they entered without any difficulty. On reaching the tomb, which was very big and made of marble, they got out their tools and lifted the enormously heavy lid, propping it up so that there was just enough room for a man to squeeze his way inside. When this operation was complete, one of them said, "Who's going in?" "I'm not," said the other. "And I'm not either," said the first. "How about Andreuccio?" "I won't do it," said Andreuccio, whereupon both the others rounded on him, saying, "What do you mean you won't do it? If you don't damn well get in there quickly, we'll give you such a hammering over the pate with these iron bars that we'll kill you stone dead." Shaking with fear, Andreuccio crawled into the tomb, thinking to himself as he did so, "These two are making me go inside so as to leave me in the lurch. Once I've handed everything out, they'll go about their business while I'm still struggling my way out of the tomb, and I shall be left empty-handed." He therefore decided that before doing anything else, he would make certain of his own share of the plunder. Remembering what they had said about the precious ring, as soon as he reached the floor of the vault, he took the ring from the Archbishop's finger and put it on his own. Then he handed out the crosier, the mitre, and the gloves, and having stripped the body down to the shift and handed everything out, he told them there was nothing left. The others insisted that the ring should be there, and told him to make a thorough search, but he replied that he was unable to find it, and kept them waiting for some little time, pretending to look for it. And, since for their part they were just as sharp-witted as Andreuccio, they told him to go on looking. As soon as they got the chance, they took away the prop supporting the lid. Then they made off, leaving Andreuccio imprisoned inside the tomb. You can easily imagine the effect that all of this had on Andreuccio. He tried again and again, using first his head and then his shoulders to see if he could raise the lid, but he was merely wasting his energies. And in the end, in the depths of despair, he fainted and collapsed on the Archbishop's corpse. If anyone could have seen them at that moment, he would have had a job to tell which of the two, the Archbishop or Andreuccio, was the cadaver. But when Andreuccio came to his senses, he burst into copious tears, for he realized beyond any doubt that there were only two possible ends in store for him. Either he would die of hunger and the noxious odors inside the tomb, covered all over in maggots from the dead body, or, if someone were to come and find him there, he would be hanged as a thief. Whilst these unpleasant thoughts were running through his mind, feeling thoroughly down in the dumps, he heard a number of people talking and moving about in the cathedral, and quickly realized that they had come to carry out the work already completed by himself and his companions. Whereupon he became considerably more alarmed. But having opened the tomb and propped up the lid, they began to argue about who should go inside, and no one was willing to do it. However, after much heated discussion, a priest came forward saying, "What are you afraid of? Do you think he's going to devour you? Dead men don't eat the living. I will go in myself." Having said this, he laid his chest upon the edge of the tomb and, swiveling around, thrust his legs inside, preparatory to descending, with only his head sticking out. When Andreuccio saw this, he stood up, grasped the priest by one of his legs, giving the priest the impression that he was about to be dragged down into the tomb. The priest no longer felt this happening. Then he let out an ear-splitting yell and hurled himself bodily out of the tomb. The rest of the gang was terrified by this turn of events, and leaving the tomb open, they all started running away as though they were being pursued by 10,000 devils. When Andreuccio perceived what had happened, he was contented beyond his wildest hopes, and clambering hastily out, he left the cathedral by the way he had come. By now it was almost daybreak, and as he was wandering aimlessly along with the ring on his finger, he eventually came to the waterfront. Shortly thereafter, he stumbled across his inn, where he found that his companions and the innkeeper had been up all night, wondering what on earth had happened to him. After telling them what had happened, he was urged by the innkeeper to leave Naples at once. He promptly followed the innkeeper's advice and returned to Perugia, having invested in a ring the money with which he had set out to purchase horses. There ends the story. I hope you've enjoyed it.